Welcome back to the Ruddy Brew. My name is T. Edge, and this is part 3 of the documentary. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my newest subscribers for showing support. I know it's been a long time since I've dropped a video, but I know you all understand the importance of accurate information. And I also prefer that I get the information correct the first time instead of trying to maintain the false narratives that have been circulating within the past 200 years, especially about who we are. Now, if you're new here, I'd like to encourage you once again to subscribe. But I'd like for you to wait until after you've heard the presentation. But after you've heard the presentation, just don't forget to turn your phone to the side and click my little watermark down here in the corner and become a subscriber. With that being said, I know that at some point I will bring up Christians and Jews and maybe even Muslims. So as a disclaimer, I'd like to say that I don't condone any racist or superiority ideologies. All individuals are created equal. Also, every man and woman is entitled to practice the religion of his or her choosing, and they shouldn't be discriminated against based upon their religious preferences. Along with that, if at any time you feel that you can debunk this information that I present here, please feel free to do so. The only thing I ask is that you attack the information and not the presenter. So we're talking slave trade. You know I want to talk about it. Let's go.
Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing until you come. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing until you come. Taking time, waiting on you. Taking time, waiting on you. Taking time, waiting on you. I can't do nothing until you come.
In part 1, we discussed who the original Hebrews of Europe were and what the difference was between them and the modern day Jews, known as the Ashkenazim. In part 2, we discussed Christianity and the blacks of Europe and beyond, the church and monarchy. And it started a long time ago. Not as a So this finally gets us to the slave trade, or what we were made to believe was a 1619 trade of African bodies as cargo into a system of enslavement. So as we get into this, the very first thing that I think we need to have addressed is the fact that the transatlantic slave trade is what most of us know as a reason that black people who are descendants of slaves are in the Americas. Am I right? After all, the transatlantic slave trade was an operation that was very detailed. It was organized, and it was operated by the church and state, or at least the church and monarchy. And it started a long time ago. Not as a trade, but as a canon issued by the monarchy that actually held the reins of the papacy. In the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabella the Catholic, etc., on page 235, at the bottom, in the last paragraph, we begin reading. Under the Visigothic Empire, the Jews multiplied exceedingly in the country and were permitted to acquire considerable power and wealth. But no sooner had their Arian masters embraced the Orthodox faith than they began to testify their zeal by pouring on the Jews the most pitiless storm of persecution. One of their laws alone condemned the whole race to slavery. And Montesquieu remarks, without much exaggeration, that to the Gothic code may be traced all the maxims of the modern Inquisition, the monks of the 15th century only copying in reference to the Israelites, the bishops of the 7th. Now, of course, I didn't just want to stick and stay there. I wanted to verify this information. So I have a couple other sources that verify what I've just read in reference to the Israelites, the bishops of the 7th. And also, history of the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella the Catholic. On page 163, at the bottom, we have the same statement. So, this decree was a reconstitution of a decree or canon from the 7th century. So I went and I found sources to verify this 7th century canon. In the book Sephardim, or The History of the Jews in Spain and Portugal by James Finn, published in 1841, on page 118, it reads, "The 8th canon was that produced to meet the emergency. Passing over its lengthy and inflated introduction, these were its stringent enactments. By command of our most pious and religious King Urgica, who burning with the zeal for the Lord and impelled by ardor of holy faith, not merely desires to avenge the insult offered to Christ's cross, but also to obviate with severity the destruction which they savagely engaged to bring upon this people and country, that being deprived of all they possess, and these possessions both of the perjurers themselves and their posterity, being confiscated to the national treasury, they be dispersed from their homes throughout the provinces of Spain, and be subjected to perpetual slavery under those to whom he may assign them, and remain so forever, neither by any cognizance, while they abide in the obstinacy of their unbelief, shall any opportunity be afforded of recovering the condition of freedom for those who by numberless transgressions are branded." Now let's just say I kind of got a feeling that there's a skeptic out there who wants to see another source with these words. So I'd like to add this one also. In the book, The History of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, from the earliest times to their final expulsions from those kingdoms and their subsequent dispersion, beginning on page 26, it reads, "Toledo held the following year, 694, instead of the vague accusation that he had recently learned by open avowal that the Hebrews had plotted with others beyond the sea to effect the ruin of Christendom, that council enacted Canon 8, by command of our most pious King Urgica, who inflamed with the zeal for the Lord and impelled by ardor for their holy faith, not only wishes to avenge the insult offered to Christ's cross, but to prevent by severity the ruin they had savagely engaged to bring on his country and people, and the perjurers themselves and their posterity be deprived of all their property and possessions, the same being confiscated to the national treasury, that they be deprived of their houses, they be deprived of their homes in all the provinces of Spain, and be subjected to perpetual slavery under those he may assign them to, and so remain forever, nor shall any opportunity by cognizance be afforded them, or recovering their liberty, while they continue abstain in their unbelief, for they are branded with numberless transgressions." You see, the Portuguese were the originators of the transatlantic slave trade. And what many of us don't know is that Isabella, the Queen of Spain, even against the word of her husband Ferdinand, procured the first Negro for slavery in 1501. In fact, it was at this time that all Negroes born within the Spanish territories were being enslaved. These Spanish territories also came to include the territories in which the Spanish had put up forts along the slave coast in West Africa. The author Charles Cookout Jones even confirms this in the controversial book, The Religious Instruction of the Negroes, on page 2. Account of the introduction of Negroes into the colonies under the government of Great Britain. It was in the year 1501 that Isabella of Spain granted permission for the introduction of Negro slaves into Hispaniola, but much only as had been born in Spain or in slavery among Christians. And in the following year, a few had been sent into the New World. In 1508, the Spaniards opened a direct trade in slaves and imported Negroes into Hispaniola from the Portuguese settlements on the coast of Guinea. Ferdinand V, by royal ordinance, enjoined a direct traffic in slaves between Guinea and Hispaniola in 1511, and Charles V in 1512 and 13. In 1517, Charles V granted a patent to one of his Flemish favorites containing an exclusive right of importing slaves, 4,000 annually, into Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. This favorite sold his patent to some Guyanese merchants for 25,000 ducats, and they were the first who brought into regular form that commerce for slaves between Africa and America, which has since been carried on under such revolting circumstances and so much an amazing extent. 45 years after, in 1562 and 63, the English entered the trade under Sir John Hawkins and carried Negroes from Africa to Hispaniola. And in 1567, Queen Elizabeth protected and shared the traffic. Thus, Mother Country was engaged in the traffic 45 years before the first permanent settlement was made in her American colonies, which was at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. The Dutch, in common with other maritime nations of Europe, engaged in the trade, and a man of war of the nation from the coast of Guinea in August 1620, 4 months before the Plymouth colony arrived in the Americas. This information correlates with the passage we showed earlier from the history of the Inquisition of Spain. But what really kicked things off? We've read how in 1492 the Hebrews were expelled from Spain after a decree was handed down that all Hebrews would be slaves for perpetuity, following or reconstituting a decree from the year 694. But the reality of it is that the Catholics were very adamant about forcing the faith on the people. In the case of the Jews, who had come to be known as enemies of Christ, there was a lingering suspicion, especially of those who were baptized. Unlike the tolerance that is shown in our current society for certain things, tolerance for any religion that was not Roman Catholic back then was very short-sighted. The Christians had the expectation that anyone who was baptized would automatically forego their family traditions and customs. When it came to the Jews, the suspicions were supported by the customary practices of their ancestors. Here listed are a few of the things that could get someone arrested in the Inquisition. In the book, The Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition, beginning on page 37. It is interesting to know what were considered as proofs of a relapse into Judaism. 37 articles were drawn out, and the mention of a few of them is sufficient to prove how frivolous and absurd were the grounds which sufficed to deprive multitudes of unfortunate fellow creatures of happiness, property, and life. It was to be investigated whether an individual had made a difference between Saturday and other days by laying a white cloth on the table or putting on a clean shirt or better clothes than on other days, whether he had cut the throat of a fowl and killing it for food, or had withdrawn the sinew from an animal destroyed for the same purpose, whether he had eaten meat during Lent or on the fast prescribed by the church, or had abstained from food on the Jewish Day of Atonement or other Hebrew fasts, or had used baths, cut his hair, or pared his nails on days preceding such fasts, or had eaten unleavened bread, or used certain herbs in Passover, or procured green branches, or made presents of fruit to friends at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or drunk kasher wine, that prepared for Jewish ceremonials, or eaten meat killed by Jews, or repeated certain Jewish blessings on particular occasions, or recited the Psalms of David without concluding with the words, "Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost." Whether any parent had given Hebrew names to his children, or washed or shaved the head of a child on the part on which the chrism of baptism had been poured, or invited his friends and relations to dine before leaving on a long journey, or whether a dying man had turned his face to the wall, or had it so turned by others, or a dead body had been washed in warm water, or the water had been emptied out from all vessels in the house of a deceased person, together with a long catalogue of similar inquiries. Such were among the proofs of relapse from the newly adopted faith into the errors of the old superstition. Sad indeed was the fate of those whom it could be pretended that they cooked their stews in oil instead of lard, and many old Christians in after times had to repent that their casual dislike to pork or shellfish had brought them under the suspicion of being secret votaries of what it pleased the inquisitors to designate as the impious law of Moses. These, my friend, were the rituals that would be considered practice in Judaism. So no, it wasn't the Ashkenazi customs that are practiced by our European brethren that they themselves developed in the years following the Bel Shem. They are the customs that seem to have followed many slaves in the transatlantic slave trade to the various islands and territories where they were ultimately enslaved. But now that we've read that the slave trade included Negroes who were born in the territories of Spain more than 100 years prior to the settling of the New World, is it a wonder why the transatlantic slave trade has been given its own narrative? It kind of gives videos like this one more credibility within the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, so part two of slave ships are not real. Listen up, listen up. Look, so y'all telling me that y'all really believe that 12.7 million of us was brought over here on slave ships that held 200 to 600 people per ship, right? And this voyage that they brought us over on these ships that they brought us, it took 3 to 4 months for us to get here. And y'all telling me they had enough drinking water and enough food to keep majority of us alive. Out of that 12.7 million they supposed to brought over, they say only 10.7 made it. Y'all really believe that? Man, wake up, man. Y'all, they told me that too. They told all of us that. It's no proof to what they told us, and y'all.
I mean, did this video make any sense to you? Let's turn to some verified history. This book entitled Ouida, The Social History of a West African Slaving Port, 1727 to 1892, authored by Robin Law, is a compilation of some of the data and statistics surrounding the transfer of slaves from Africa to the Brazils. And when it comes to doing research, I believe reading in context ties up loose ends where skimming just finds supportive information or what is known as confirmation bias. And it causes you to miss more vital information. And I'll admit that that's something that I did or that I am guilty of doing in the past, but I actually read this book. Now, again, just to be clear, this book only covers the period from 1727 to 1892. That's over 200 years of migratory data that's not included within this work. And before I forget, let me shout out once again Brother Garfield Reed for recommending me this book. For the longest, he's been debating others on the credibility of the 1747 map by Emmanuel Boyne. It shows the kingdom of Judah in Africa along the slave coast. He's argued a few times that there was no way that the French would call this place Judah. But there is little to no consideration given that the French are neighbors to the Spanish, and that the Jews were in the French territories for centuries also. And if you saw the first segment, you know that the Jews were running all over Europe. British or English territories, Dutch, German, Poland, Italy, and France, all north and northeast of Spain. They were also running to the Americas prior to the colonizing of efforts of the Europeans. We've heard mentions of their retreat into Turkey, Italy, which is Rome, and as far as Asian territories. Leo Africanus has left us a history that was conveyed and confirmed in the 1700s that many of the Jews who lived along the Niger River were exiles from these European territories from different periods throughout history. And not only were they Jews by blood, but they were also called Christians via religion. These men and women were converts to Christianity or new Christians, and conforming Jews who were just simply exiled for not converting to Catholicism. But if we turn to Robin Law's book, we see that the Portuguese had forts in Ouida along with the English and the French, and at one point the Dutch. You see, during this period in history, the Dahomians had conquered the slave coast, and they set up shop in this town named Ouida, pronounced by the locals as Wada. And it was depicted in the movie The Woman King. This town was located in the country of Ouida, but the book informs us that the slaves didn't come from Ouida. The kidnappers went inland to procure slaves for their European employers, who provided them with different forms of payment. This fort was the one place that all European nations could dock without any infighting. Remember that TikTok video I played just a moment ago? Well, this is what the record shows as far as the numbers of slaves transported per year from the slave coast, or from Ouida or Wada. Seems as if at the height of it all, there were just a little more than 12,000 slaves being transported from the slave coast per year. This should have the antenna raised for some people. In fact, because they were procuring slaves from the inland, the Europeans weren't happy about things. In the book, Some Historical Account of Guinea, its situation, produce, and the general dispositions of its inhabitants, with an inquiry into the rise and progress of the slave trade, its nature and lamentable effects, by Anthony Benezet. On page 19, it reads, "Here, the Europeans have the greatest number of forts and factories, from whence, by means of the Negro factors, a trade is carried on about 700 miles back in the inland country, whereby great numbers of slaves are procured, as well by means of the wars which arise amongst the Negroes, or are fomented by the Europeans, as those brought from the back country. Here we find the natives more reconciled to the European manners and trade, but at the same time much more inured to war, and ready to assist the European traders in procuring loadings for the great number of vessels which come yearly on those coasts for slaves." 700 miles put into perspective is from Charleston, South Carolina to Canada. And not just Canada, but nearly 20 miles north of Toronto. So no wonder the Europeans were unhappy. It took a long time for slaves to be procured. And clearly, they were not trafficking inhabitants of Wada. When we look at a map, the 700 miles correlates to the distance between modern-day Benin and Niger. But what I want to get to is the fact that many of the slaves, according to Robin Law, were able to move freely about. They were black men who ultimately came from Brazil, and having at least one white or European grandparent, they were considered mulatto. They had begun to be known as Christians, being called white men because of the religion and not their skin tone, as confirmed by this segment from Wada or Wida by Robin Law. The term European or white man, Yovo, in local usage included descendants of Europeans by African women, such as Mariki Lemon, hereditary governor of the English fort in 1850, who was biologically only 1/4 white. Indeed, the term Yovo was constructed in cultural rather than racial terms. Returned ex-slaves from Brazil or Sierra Leone, although of pure African descent, being also counted as white men who thus enjoyed the privilege of Europeans. For example, when attending the king at the capital, they were excused from the Dahomian practice of prostration and were permitted merely to bow. In effect, as the French Catholic mission in the 1860s noted, the term white man was used to mean Christian. The European community in Wada in this period also became predominantly, specifically Brazilian. So here is another important piece of information that must be addressed. Even the black men who had gained their freedom and come back into the area of Wada were called white men because of the Christian or Catholic religion. So this understanding that a few of our brethren have when we read passages in old books that are referring to white men coming into Africa and having children with African women, it's more than likely referring to the new Christians, especially those who were exiles in these African territories. Now, for many of us, I know that this information is confusing because for our entire lives, we've been taught that slaves were either prisoners of war or prisoners who had been imprisoned for crimes committed. I've come to believe that this descriptor, prisoner of war, is just a clever way of describing the new Christians who had maintained their Hebrew customs and had become exiled from Europe. The natives of these African territories were paid to either make war with the suspecting camps or to imprison all of the new Christians who could be easily identified based on their differences. And as I just stated, the slaves were kidnapped from 700 miles inland, or the territory we know today as Niger. For many of us who have been reading and hearing information relayed since 2014 and what is now disparagingly called the awakening, one of the very first things we learned was about the Portuguese king rounding up children of Hebrews, stripping them from their families and exporting them as cargo to the unwholesome island of Sao Tome, or St. Thomas in English. This began during the Portuguese expulsion in approximately 1495. Returning to the book, The History of the Jews from the War with Rome to the Present Time, beginning on page 246. It reads, "Many were terrified by the tales of barbarities practiced on their countrymen by the savage inhabitants of the African coast, and many had been enfeebled by the pestilence which had broken out among them. No sooner had the 8 months expired than the penalty was enforced, and the whole of the loiterers became the slaves of the king. Those who were young and able-bodied were forcefully baptized and then carried off to colonize the island of St. Thomas in the Gulf of Guinea, which had recently become a Portuguese possession. In 1495, John was succeeded by Emmanuel, known in history as the Fortunate. His succession appeared at first to promise the miserable Jews some respite from their sufferings. He revoked the edict under which such as had remained in the kingdom became slaves. He refused a large sum of money which had been presented to him by some wealthy Jews, and professed his determination of treating them with equity and mercy. In an unhappy hour, Emmanuel sued for the hand of the Infanta Isabella, daughter of the Catholic sovereigns of Spain, and they would not consent to the marriage except on the condition that their son-in-law should banish the Jews from Portugal as they had banished them from Spain. He issued a proclamation from Murcia ordering all Jews still within his dominions to embrace the Christian faith within the space of 3 months or to depart from Portugal. 3 ports were at first named Lisbon, Oporto, and Setúbal, from any of which the Jews might embark, but subsequently this order was revoked, and Lisbon was named as the only place of embarkation. He dispatched a secret order that all children under 14 should be separated from their parents and brought up in the Christian faith. Such scenes of horror ensued as imagination cannot picture. Well, Robin Law also mentions in his work that nearly 400 years later, Sao Tome was still in operation. It was still Roman Catholic, and it was still staffed by black priests who I, in making a fair observation, will call descendants of those Hebrew children who were forcefully baptized prior to being enslaved. And having been taken over by the French, they are reported to know nothing outside of reading the Mass and conducting religious ceremonies. And in 1865, the Portuguese revived the slave trade to Sao Tome. 20 years later, signing a treaty to protect Dahomey as they began transporting slaves to the island once again. With that being confirmed, I don't think we should be any longer arguing who had Mr. Barbeau's reference correct in the passage that reads, Barbeau states that in the reign of Don John II, and about the close of the 15th century, large numbers of Jews were expelled from Portugal and taken to the coast of southern Guinea, that the island of St. Thomas, which is not more than 100 miles from the mainland, was populated by mulattoes descended from the Jewish exiles and Anglo women. It is possible that the Jewish type of character noticed at the Gabon and Luango may have originated from this source, but if so, it is unknown to the present inhabitants of the country, and it would have been somewhat singular if the Roman Catholic missionaries at Luango had not detected this circumstance instead of regarding them as a pure African family of Jews. You see, if we only consider the logistics, we know without question that the slaves of Sao Tome came from Portugal directly. So how would they be offspring of women from Angola, especially when you consider that the island of Sao Tome is 1,100 miles from Angola by air? This math just ain't mathing. It's not making sense. It would be a much simpler correlation when you look at the fact that these Jews in Europe already had access to Anglo women. Now, I tried to find the original source for this reference, but it's not available anywhere online that I could find anyway. But I did find a writing of another Frenchman, our Father Labat, or John Baptiste Labat. And let's see what he had to say about the inhabitants of Sao Tome. Now I have to use Google Translate because this book is in French. And I won't try to pronounce the name of the book. But here on page 4, it reads, its capital city is called South Tome, and more commonly Penosian. It has a castle surrounded by 4 bastions. Besides this city, there are several villages spread over the island, and according to the report of the people of the country, nearly 400 sugar mills and about 700 families of white Portuguese or mulattoes. That is to say, born of a Portuguese and a Negro or black. The mulattoes often marry Negroes and produce at the end children who, although black as coal, do not hesitate to call themselves Portuguese. And in this quality, they are raised to ecclesiastical, political, and military offices and are regarded as faithful, that is to say, nobles or gentlemen. Almost all the clergy of the cathedral were of this color. The bishop was almost the only white priest that there was in the island. When the night of the Marchese passed through, there on the voyage that preceded the one whose journal I give here, there's a very large number of Negro slaves in the island. They are baptized and all wear a rosary on their necks. It is a principal piece of their Christianity. In this same book, on page 35, it reads, this is all the artillery of the city, in which there are only about 50 white Portuguese. This is the artillery of the city, in which there are only about 50 white Portuguese. The rest are mulattoes or free Negroes, who possess a large number of black slaves. There are a few villages spread out in the life, and a good number of sugar mills. But the principal trade of all the inhabitants is to raise cattle from the island of the and poultry, to cultivate rice, prinnick, millet, maíz, manioc, to have a quantity of grass, lemons, orange, limes, coconuts, potatoes, yams, figs, bananas, and other fruits, which they trade profitably, both with the neighboring mainland and with the ships, which after having traded in Judah, Ardres, Popo, and other places of commerce on the coast of Guinea, come to buy food and refreshments, to continue their voyage to Brazil and other places in America. It also often happens that the ships which go to the East Indies, or which return from there, being upset by the winds and blown into the Gulf of Guinea, come there to take on water and food. So these slaves in Sao Tome, according to everything that we've read in the past about the slaves that were sent to Sao Tome, were Jews, and the writing of Jean-Baptiste Labat confirmed that any white families were actually mulattoes who were descended from Negroes mixed with Portuguese or white Portuguese. What we understand is that only Jews were enslaved there, and he confirms that the slaves are distinctly classified as Negroes who are baptized and wear rosaries. These were likely the descendants of the Jewish children who were baptized, then sent to Sao Tome by King John to be brought up as Christians aka Catholics. Furthermore, he even provides with other info that I haven't been privy to hearing any other relators of info touch on. He speaks on an island called St. Anthony that is 30 leagues from St. Thomas. And there on that island are free Negroes who own black slaves. Very curious language when we know that Negro and black are the exact same word. So you mean to tell me that there were blacks coming out of Spain who held other blacks as slaves? This didn't shock me. I'm not in disbelief. We know that there were blacks or Jews who genuinely converted to Catholicism. We know that they apparently took things to heart. It's no different than what we see today. If we look at the political landscape during our entire history of our plight here in America, even today in 2024, politics have black people divided to every extent that they would even be willing to unalive one another for opposing their political and or religious affiliations. The point that I'm making is that there are some who are skinfolk and some even kinfolk that would prefer to side with the party that they feel gives them the status and the immunity instead of having to face the opposition. And sometimes they feel that siding with the establishment will allow them to protect themselves and those closest to them. And I'm sure that that's what's happened with some of the cases with these blacks who own slaves on the island of St. Anthony. But let's move forward. So we know that these slaves were being transported all over from South America to North America. We find, however, that not only were these people being exiled from everywhere in Europe, but they were scattering all over, even into territories of South America, Central America, and I believe even in North America. This is why there were mulattoes and many blacks who have history here in the Americas before it was America. Let's remember what Labat said in his writing. Negroes who had one European grandparent was considered mulatto. This is why everywhere they went, the Spanish followed. Later, accompanied by the Dutch, the French, and ultimately the English. In Africa, the people of Dahomey were being paid to make war with tribes as far as 700 miles from Wada's slave market in Niger. All were being tormented by the Inquisitional and being made into Roman Catholics, being baptized by force before being hauled off to be abused in a system that was designed against them. It's pretty clear to me. What we don't understand is the significance of Christianity within the trade. We should, but we don't. We'd rather argue about who came up with the best philosophy or who can formulate a new ideology, and we aren't the least bit cautious of preaching the doctrines and passing information that isn't scripture but formulations by other men. And I have a most curious question. Is it a coincidence that blacks are the most church demographic in America? How is the black community more church than Roman Catholics, whose religion is the continental religion of the Europeans? Didn't the West bring Roman Catholicism to the New World? And I showed this book earlier, but knowing that the goal of the slavers in America was the same as the slavers who enslaved and burned Jews in Europe, a desire to make the blacks or Negroes aka Jews, into good Christians. Do you still find it hard to believe that it is indeed us? But whatever difficulties there may be in instructing those who are grown up before they are brought over, there are not the like difficulties in the case of their children, who are born and bred in our own plantations, who have never been accustomed to pagan rites and superstitions, and who may easily be trained up, like all other children, to any language whatsoever, and particularly to our own. If the making of them good Christians be sincerely the desire and intention of those who have the property in them and the government over them. Let us go to page 22. As to their being ungovernable after baptism than before, it is certain that the gospel everywhere enjoins not only diligence and fidelity, but also obedience for consequence sake, and does not deprive masters of any proper methods of enforcing obedience, where they appear to be necessary. Humanity forbids all cruel and barbarous treatment of our fellow creatures, and will not suffer us to consider a being that is endowed with reason on a level with brutes, and Christianity takes not out of the hands of superiors and decrees of strictness and severity, and fairly appear to be necessity or necessary for the preserving subjection and government. The general law both of humanity and of Christianity is kindness, gentleness, and compassion towards all mankind, of what nation or condition soever they be. And therefore we are to make the exercise of those amiable virtues our choice and desire, and to have resource to severe and vigorous methods, unwilling and only out of necessity. And of this necessity you yourselves remain the judges, and as much after they receive baptism as before, so that you can be of no danger and suffering by the charge as to them the greatest hardships that most severe masters can inflict upon them is not to be compared to the cruelty of keeping them in the state of heathenism and depriving them from the means of salvation as reached forth to all mankind in the gospel of Christ. This piousness needed in instruction of the Negroes here in the Americas came at any cost, just like it had in all the years prior while in Europe. In essence, the Inquisition never ended. It just took on a different look due to the passing of the torch from the father to the son, leaving off the knowledge of who these men and women were and are, and why they were subject to such severe cruelty, labeled as necessity. Ask yourself another question. If the slaves were supposed to be becoming good Christians, why were they forbidden to have worship services? Why did they have to sneak off to do so? Also, when the KKK was born, adorned in the infamous white hoods that the Catholic Church has worn for eons, why do you think they would burn crosses in the yards of blacks who stepped out of line? Their practices of lynching came directly from the playbook of the Roman Catholics. We have a hard time seeing that in all points made about the European persecution of the Hebrew communities or black Portuguese, that persecution looked just like the punishment of the same Hebrew communities of black Portuguese, which are known as Negro communities or African Americans today. The reason it was no problem for the various European race types to meet to watch the town hanging, the lynchings, the burnings, is because they have been doing it for many, many years prior to this current establishment known as the United States of America. When Negroes have their DNA sequenced and the various European nations appear as autosomal matches, it's pretty easy to reconcile that these lands are where their Hebrew foreparents once resided, and have DNA that had been swapped with the DNA of European men and women. It's not because of slave owners who were taking advantage of our women. It's not because of some random migration of a few Negroes. If you've done a DNA test, what European territories show in your autosomal profile? These are likely the locations that your Hebrew ancestors resided in Europe during a time when everywhere they resided in Europe, they were persecuted. The Black Sea or Baltic area, to include Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and other Dutch territories, the English territories, and Nordic locations are all places where the Hebrews scattered in efforts to escape persecution. This includes Amsterdam, which is located in Holland. There's a lot of artwork that can be found online being called Moors or slaves. But knowing that as the slave trade was ramping up, there were many Negroes running to and from Amsterdam, especially because of the persecution. It's likely that these so-called African faces are the images of our Hebrew ancestors who were known as New Christians. Look, we're currently seated in a pretty critical place in American history. When are we going to allow ourselves to unplug from the matrix? I'm not saying that our being the enslaved Jews means that we turn away from the Messiah. I'm not saying that the Ashkenazim shouldn't any longer practice the religion of their foreparents. I'm not even saying that black folks who practice any other religion should begin practicing something else. Heck, I'm not even saying that those who are not religious should become religious. I mean, we don't actually have to stoke any of those fires at all. And although my presentation had mentions of religion, the presentation is about ancestral lineages, not religion. It's about who we are, who we were, and what we've endured. Who were the major players, what the cause was, and what historical data we have that supports it. Yes, I know that for years, hundreds and thousands of years, people have been mixing, but that statement alone says nothing. Even if we were to focus on our mitochondrial line of black women or the Y-DNA lineage of black men, it wouldn't discredit the fact that was presented above, because the scripture and history tells us that everywhere these lineages come from are places that Israel resided. I don't know how many people will see this video or these videos. I don't know if shadow banning really exists or if the video will get metered down by the platform. I do know that the Almighty reveals things in His timing, and I'm just grateful to be able to share the information that I feel He leads me to. And with that being said, please share this video and all the videos. Every time you think about them, flood all the social media platforms. Flood the inboxes of your loved ones. Share, and share some more. It doesn't matter if you're African, Asian, European, or Native American. You can also share it with your friends and family members and on all of your social media platforms, because this information affects you as well. I covered a lot here, and I know there are going to be people who want to have discussions one way or another. And if you believe I got anything wrong, leave comments in the comment box below. I really do try to respond positively to all comments. If you enjoyed the presentation, don't forget to turn your phone to the side and click the watermark down here in the corner. Also, please don't forget to go and either click the like button if you loved it or the dislike button if you didn't like it, because these things help the algorithm push the video. I'm sure that there is a wealth of information that is yet to be uncovered and presented to all that will come and hear. But in the meantime, though, thank you once again for joining me here at the Ruddy Brew. I hope that you can see that nothing is at all what we thought it was. But until the next time, peace.